Hi folks, welcome to week 4. This week's topic is class. So, what do we mean when we say class? Class is another way of grouping people with different socioeconomic statuses. Socioeconomic status is how we talk about how much financial power a person or group has. Financial power is comprised of a number of factors. First, it's how much income you have coming in. For most people, that's pretty much just whatever your paycheck is. However, it might include profits from a business, dividends from investments, and payments from settlements or other legal agreements. Wealth, on the other hand, is how much you have total. Wealth is things like property you own, savings and retirement funds, valuables, and investments. Ultimately, though, socioeconomic status is about what sort of social status and access you have. The higher your socioeconomic status, the more places and people with influence you'll have a chance to interact with, and the more opportunities you'll have to continue to maintain and increase your overall status. The lower your socioeconomic status, the fewer opportunities you'll have to access people with influence and gain entrance to restricted places. There are a lot of factors involved in what your socioeconomic status is. Some are obvious, like income, occupation, and level of education. Other factors like familial wealth and class upbringing also have a big effect. For example, if you grow up middle class, you learn the behaviors expected of middle class people. Those behaviors, in addition to education, will allow you to obtain employment that will provide the sort of income needed to remain in middle class. There are several levels of class in the US. There is the underclass, or those living in poverty. They often have little income or wealth at all. Then we have the working poor, those who are employed, but do not make enough to meet all of their basic needs. Next, we have the working class. These tend to be workers whose jobs usually do not require much education, but whose pay is sufficient to generally meet their basic needs. Then we have the lower middle class. These are people with skilled jobs. They're usually jobs without a lot of social status, lower managers, craftspeople, semi-professionals. Next are upper middle class people, those with considerable education and jobs that require a high degree of skill and knowledge, and usually do not require physical work. These are generally knowledge workers and upper managers. Finally, we have the owning class, also known as the upper or capitalist class. All other classes receive some sort of standard paycheck from an hourly or salaried job. Owning class people's income generally comes from the profits made from businesses or the interest and dividends from investments, from things they own rather than the specific work they do. The media has a big role in how we view class. Folks in poverty are usually faceless or invisible, and often don't get to tell their own personal stories. Instead, a narrative is usually created for them. Sometimes it's how they were either down on their luck, like a really talented kid born poor. Sometimes they're portrayed as having done something to deserve their lowly status in the socioeconomic hierarchy, like fall victim to drug abuse or get fired from their job. These portrayals exist less for the people affected and more as either an inspirational or cautionary tale for working and middle class people. The middle class is normalized. These are the people portrayed as the average American family. They usually own a multi-story suburban house and have at least 2 cars. In the past, only the father worked, and his income was enough to sustain the family. In more modern portrayals, both parents work professional jobs and seem to have a fair amount of free time. There's usually an emphasis on getting along and not being rude that is used to set middle-class families apart from working-class families. Because middle-class values and behaviors are normalized, you'll see this sort of family depicted in almost every show, even if the actual employment of the characters makes this lifestyle unrealistic. Working-class families, on the other hand, are often portrayed as cruder, less refined, and less intelligent. The portrayal of their working life varies from unremarkable, that is, not important enough to really mention, to potentially unstable, to noble. Television shows like Roseanne and Bob's Burgers tend to lean towards the potentially unstable portrayal, whereas shows like Dirtiest Jobs or The Average Commercial for Pickups tend to portray the work as something noble and ultimately very American. Finally, there are the images we get of wealthy people. Their lives are usually depicted as something glamorous that should be envied. The people themselves are generally either benevolent or flashy, and those categories are really racialized. Wealthy white people are benevolent hard workers who earn their position, deserve to be able to earn their wealth, enjoy their wealth. Non-white wealthy people, particularly those in the black strata from Bonilla Silva's hierarchy, are usually considered lucky and are shown to spend their money on showy items rather than more respectable investments. There's a type of moral judgment that happens when the wealthy person isn't white. Also interesting to note, most of our news is related to what wealthy people care about. We hear a lot about global economics and little about local news, because the people with influence want to hear about that type of news. Another example, every iPhone is still sold with a Stocks app installed by default, and for many years you couldn't even uninstall it. Yet, the vast majority of stock is owned by less than 10% of Americans. That is, primarily the owning class, along with a small percentage of the upper middle class. Yet, most news reports contain daily reports on the stock market, and the folks at Apple still think it's important enough to be a default app. This is a skewed perspective towards the information demanded by wealthy people. I'd like for you to pause here and think about each of these statements. The more often you are able to say yes to these statements, the more class privilege you have. Most of us grow up with a group of concepts that we usually refer to as the American dream. It's written into our most valuable documents, the idea that all people are created equal and that we should be free to pursue life, liberty, and happiness. We generally believe that the US is a meritocracy, that if you have skills, or that if you work hard enough, you'll be able to achieve whatever you desire. We also believe in American growth, that every generation will be able to do better than the generation before it. There's also an element of consumerism involved. Success means having the best, whether it's living in a certain neighborhood, owning a certain car, being able to vacation to interesting and Instagrammable places, or just having the best toys. Most of what we consider the American dream is about social mobility. Social mobility is the ability of people to move from one socioeconomic class to another. At the time of the founding of the United States, moving between social classes was rare, and laws were designed to impede movement. Most people stayed in whatever class they were born in, and laws regarding heredity of property and other wealth were used as tools to help ensure that happened. Part of what the Founding Fathers envisioned was a country where class was based on skill and work, not on hereditary, and these are values we still echo today. But is that true? Well, sort of. It's true if you don't have extra barriers in your way. If your only marginalized identity is class, you have a pretty good chance of being able to move up. However, if you have any additional marginalized identities, your chances of moving up the class hierarchy drop dramatically. In the next video, we'll see a breakdown of how some of those identities affect social mobility.